Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. The Trump administration, while announcing relaxation of sanctions against ZTE, China's largest electronics manufacturer, just torpedoed the G7 summit meeting in Quebec and proposed new tariffs on steel and aluminum products imported from our allies Canada, Mexico, and Europe. Then, following a dazzling series of reversals and reversals of reversals, Trump announced punitive tariffs on China. Why has Trump taken the trade fight to old allies like Canada and given a pass, at least on electronics, to adversaries like China? Trump's incoherent position led financial journalist Bret Stephens, writing in the New York Times, to argue the administration is blowing up the foundations of global economic order with the same mindless glee as a child popping bubble wrap. We wonder whether America First isn't becoming America Only. Here to discuss these strange developments is Robert Hormats. Bob Hormats was a partner in Goldman Sachs who headed up Goldman Sachs International. He served as Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment in the Obama administration. He is now a vice chairman of Kissinger Associates. Bob Hormats, I'm delighted to welcome you back to the program.
Great to be here again, Jim.
Now, how about that, Bob? I mean, are we breaking up the world order with a child's mindless glee like popping bubble wrap?
Well, there seems to be no understanding of why the world order was put there in the first place, and no understanding of how beneficial it has been to the United States and to countries that support us around the world. The latest fiasco of this violent disagreement in Quebec really was particularly troublesome because we've had a lot of discussions and debates and negotiations and acrimony at ministerial level, but to have the head of state sit down with the goal initially of trying to reduce tensions and resolve trade issues and resolve numerous other issues, then to come away with what they thought was an agreement, only to have the President of the United States from afar tweeting over some offense that Trump allegedly received from Trudeau in his press conference, really blew the whole thing up and means that there are 6 countries that seem to be in agreement on most things, like trade, and 1 country, the United States, that seems to be, in the minds of its allies, trying to undermine and weaken the global trading system.
Why do you suppose that he's expressing admiration for dictators around the world like Erdogan and Duterte, Kim Jong-un, even Putin, and trashing our best friends like Justin Trudeau?
Well, it seems to me there is a real lack of historical understanding as to why we have alliances and why the G7 was put together in the first place. On the alliance point, America was great after World War II, in part because it was strong militarily and strong economically, but in part because it also had strong alliances and resolute supportive allies. That enabled us to extend our influence to various parts of the world. The Russians never had those kinds of alliances. This was an enormous plus for American security, and the fact that our trading partners had recovered with our help from World War II enabled us to trade more with them and boosted American growth as well. How much worse off would we have been if these countries had not recovered? So it was in our interest to have allies for security and economically strong trading partners for our economic benefit. The G7 was put together in 1975. I was the Sherpa, or the planner, or the presidential advisor for that meeting at Rambouillet and numerous others since. That meeting was put together because after the oil crisis of 1973, there was a disarray among Western countries and a lot of inflation. So the whole idea was for the Western countries to work together to do 2 things. 1, to come out of this difficulty with collective efforts to work with one another to make sure that inflation didn't continue at a very high rate and make sure we had financial stability. But second, to underpin our alliances because we were at that point still in the Cold War. This set of problems, not just one problem, but set of problems in Quebec, this deep acrimony and lack of unity, has reversed all of those. It's weakened the prospects of resolving economic difficulties. In fact, it's exacerbated them. And it has weakened confidence among our friends and allies in our reliability as a friend and an ally, which has negative implications for American security. So it did everything that the original G7 and subsequent G7s by 7 presidents subsequently has done. And
Republican and Democrat.
Republican and Democrats. Ronald Reagan was a big supporter of this. Both Bushes were a big supporter of this, along with Bill Clinton and other Democrats. So it reversed what was done and what had been done by 7 American presidents over the course of over 40 years, with one set of very acrimonious discussions and a follow-up set of very acrimonious tweets.
Well, Canada is our second largest bilateral trading partner. We have a surplus balance of trade with Canada. What is the point of taking them on this way?
There is really no point in taking on Canada or Mexico or numerous other countries. There are certainly issues with Canada, and we've had them over a period of time, but most of them have been resolved, and we have differences with other countries with which we trade a great deal. There are bound to be trade frictions, in some cases difficult ones, but the way to deal with them is through negotiations. And for the president to say that all the negotiations in the past were great failures and were adverse to American interests is really a huge misunderstanding, because a lot of companies and a lot of jobs and a lot of consumers depend on robust trade agreements. It's not to say they were perfect. It's not to say the United States didn't give up certain things, but in a negotiation you give up certain things to get certain things. That's the nature of a negotiation, and by and large has served the interest of the United States. One can go back and say there were mistakes made here or there. True, absolutely right. But you don't resolve those mistakes by tearing up the agreements or causing major confrontations with our allies.
What is Trump's basic problem with Canada?
He has problems. The Canadians have a very different set of programs to support their dairy industry with some subsidies.
But that's a minuscule portion of the trade balance.
It's a very small portion of the trade balance. It hurts certain dairy farmers, but it is not a sufficiently serious issue to blow up our entire trading relationship with them. And then he has other things that he has talked about with Trudeau, which is putting in place in the new NAFTA, NAFTA 2.0, so to speak, a sunset agreement which would end after 5 years. In other words, it would not be renewed after 5 years, or be up for renewal but in doubt in 5 years. Well, trade agreements depend on a consistent set of relations. That is to say, if you're developing trading partners in another country, you want to be sure that the rules of the game are going to be there not just for 5 years, but for an extended period of time. So you can develop your partnerships, you can develop your lines of supply. But to have a 5-year sunset, the Canadian view is that that would in fact inhibit investment in Canada, because the uncertainty after 5 years would mean that companies wouldn't know what the ground rules were after 5 years.
And why is the administration so protectionist? I mean, historically, the Republican Party has been the low tariff party. It's the Democratic Party that's been the high tariff party, and tariffs are inflationary, and tariffs don't help trade. In fact, they are a shadow over trade.
Yeah. They're a tax. They're a tax like I put a tax on widgets, or I put a tax on any other product. They are a tax on imported goods.
And they increase the price.
They increase the price of the imported good, and they enable domestic producers of competing goods to increase their prices as well. So they're inflationary on the import side, and they're inflationary on the domestic side. Since if you're producing and the imports cost more, you can raise your internal prices. So they are inflationary. The other part of the problem is that other countries have their interests too. And we're beginning to see now that when we impose tariffs or threaten to impose tariffs on other countries say, well, we'll just retaliate by imposing tariffs on key sectors in your economy. So a lot of people are disadvantaged, and over a period of time this can spin out of control. That's my worry about what's happening now, that these acrimonious tweets and arguments are going to cause us to take further action, other countries to retaliate, and we retaliate against them. And then we're in a full-scale trade war, as we had in the 1920s, and that certainly ended up very badly for the United States and the world.
Well, we'll get to the trade war in a minute, but we have a representative of the White House, Peter Navarro, saying there's a special place in hell for the Prime Minister of Canada. He dialed back from that subsequently, did not apologize. He also said that Trudeau was dishonest, negotiated in bad faith, and was weak. I mean, there's all this, as you put it, acrimonious rhetoric. Does it help matters any?
No, it doesn't. And Trudeau and the Canadians, as you pointed out, have been allies for the United States for centuries. And World War II is a good example, but it's not the only war. They have been supportive in various parts of the Middle East and Afghanistan.
Well, in the Cold War, they cooperated in having a North American deterrent to missiles from Russia.
And our whole strategic early warning system for an attack on the United States depends very heavily on Canada. A lot of our radar systems and surveillance systems are in Canada because, of course, things would come, if they're coming over the pole, to Canada before they come here.
Let's move from Canada, our second largest bilateral trading partner, to our largest bilateral trading partner, China. The messages out of the White House are a little uneven. First, he removed sanctions on China's largest electronics company, ZTE, without any real explanation, even though they were trading with Iran and North Korea. And at the same time, he threatened to impose 25% sanctions on Chinese goods. I mean, how do you harmonize these two events?
Well, it is, of course, is very confusing. The ZTE issue really never was a trade issue per se. It was considered, by the United States at least, as an enforcement issue. So that has gotten now morphed into the trade discussions where it was supposed to be somewhat separate. Now you've got with China this question of the $50 billion in goods that the president is probably, or at least says he might, impose tariffs on. He hasn't quite decided what to do. That's the 15th when we'll hear about that. And then later in the month, there's a question of what barriers, if any, will be imposed on Chinese investment, particularly certain types of high-tech Chinese investment in the United States, which the administration is also threatening. So whether he's going to do it and what the effect of the summit in Singapore will have on that remains to be seen. But the Chinese have told us that under threat of sanctions, and particularly if the United States imposes new tariffs on them, which the president's threatened to do, then they will not negotiate on these other trade issues. And there are many people in the business community who are less focused on the tariffs and don't really think tariffs are going to do very much, and are more focused on things in China like China 2025, which is a set of policies to support primarily high-tech industries and make them more competitive through subsidies and through other types of government support. The business community, I think, is much more concerned about that, and the Chinese are not going to negotiate on that or anything else if the United States imposes tariffs on them. Moreover, they'll also impose higher barriers of some sort, probably tariffs, on certain American products going to China.
So we have a kind of trade war, which could escalate. And who wins a trade war between the United States and China?
Well, the president has this view that trade wars are okay and are easily winnable.
But Navarro said we're in a trade war now, so
well, we're
he
not
doesn't
quite
mind
in
more of a trade war.
We're not quite in a trade war yet, but we could be on the verge of one. And I think that we have to decide, and the administration has to decide, whether we're going to move into a trade war, or all these threats and all this bluster is really a negotiating tactic to have more accelerated types of negotiations and resolve these issues in a negotiating way, with this as a threat, but not carrying out the threat, only using it as a lever to negotiate a better deal. The problem is that other countries have public opinions too, not just the United States. China may not be a democracy, but it certainly has public opinion, and the government is responsive to that. Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, they're democracies. They also have public opinion. So when you start threatening these countries, as with Europe with these tariffs on steel and aluminum, they're reacting very strongly, and they're saying, look, we're not going to negotiate under the gun either, and we're going to start taking action against your products that you sell in Europe. So no one's going to win from a trade war, and the president may think it's winnable, but there'll be a lot of losers between now and there if it is. And I would say that the history of trade wars is that no one wins, and there's a lot of carnage left on the battlefield.
And higher prices for American consumers and loss of jobs for American manufacturers.
You're already going to see that. If you start restricting the imports of steel, the price of beer cans will go up, the price of cars will go up, the price of infrastructure. The president's a big supporter of infrastructure. The price of those steel girders that you see on the Tappan Zee Bridge and other things, those go up as well, and in some cases quite substantially. So construction, infrastructure prices, costs go up.
And what is our beef with China anyway? I mean, they don't manufacture a plane like Boeing or Airbus. They may manufacture component parts for planes, which we're glad to import because that creates jobs for Americans and assembling the component parts into airplanes. They don't manufacture a car of any competitive stature in the world.
Not that they sell here. They compete elsewhere, but not here. They compete
elsewhere, but they do sell component parts for cars.
Sure.
And electronic devices for that are used in cars quite a great deal now. But what is our beef with China? What is the competition?
There are issues on intellectual property protection. There are issues on business secrets protection. There are issues with respect to steel that China provides subsidies so that the Chinese sell their steel at lower prices around the world, although we only import 3% of our steel from China. Other countries import more. So
but these are matters for the World Trade Organization.
They're matters for the World Trade Organization. They're also bilateral issues. The question is, how do you get at these practices? And the bigger question is, do the Chinese relent because the United States is imposing tariffs on their goods, on their steel or on their aluminum or on their automobiles? And do they give in simply because the United States is taking these kinds of actions? Or do they dig in their heels, as they have said they're going to do, and say, we're not going to negotiate if you impose tariffs on us?
So wouldn't it appear that if there's a trade war with China, China will win?
They may not win, but they can do a lot of damage in the process. And we won't win, but we can receive a lot of damage in the process. So it's hard to say who would win, but if you look at the financial markets, they've been doing very well. The economy has been doing very well. But in the midst of a trade war where some American companies, we shouldn't forget, have 50% of their revenues derived from abroad, 50%. Most high-tech companies have a third to half of their revenues derived from abroad, and a lot of their market is China. So the stock market will be impacted, your 401k will be impacted, and inflation will be impacted, and the Fed then becomes more concerned about inflationary pressures, which are already beginning to build because you see wages going up and the costs of a lot of goods are going up. So the Fed pays attention to that.
Have you looked at all at our state governments? Are our state governments as xenophobic, anti-immigration, anti-trade as the federal government appears to be?
You've put your finger on a really interesting irony, and that is that as Washington becomes more inward-looking, more xenophobic, more protectionist, largely led by the White House, but there's support from members of the Republican Party and some Democrats. But at the state level and the city level, it's altogether different, altogether different. And that is, you see governors going all around the world in search of investment to come to their states. Mayors do the same. And they want to help their companies to trade around the world. So they lead major trade delegations. When I was Under Secretary of State, we used to have a program with the Chinese where we would work out arrangements for American governors, particularly from Western states, but really from all over in the end, meeting with Chinese party secretaries of the various provinces, or the governors of the various provinces, or the mayors of very large cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen and Beijing, And they would have conversations about how the Chinese provinces and the Chinese cities and the American states and the American cities can get together and trade more with one another. Investment would come as a result of both sides improving the atmosphere for foreign investment. Us improving the atmosphere for Chinese investment, Chinese doing the same for American investment. So the irony is that as the nation, as Washington becomes more inward-looking, more protectionist, more xenophobic, the states are more outward-looking, more welcoming of foreign investment, and more eager to develop trade relations because they know that's where the jobs are. The job benefits of more trade with Chinese provinces or Indian states or Brazilian states or other countries are substantial, and they want foreign investment because they know foreign investment is a huge job creator. And talk about autos, one of the biggest single foreign job creating aspects of business in the United States is auto factories, from the big Japanese and the big German auto producers in particular. It's a big plus for many localities. Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina, numerous other states benefit from that.
Well, and also foreign workers coming here and from Mexico or wherever and performing jobs Americans don't want to perform or can't perform. That's very important to local government in Texas and
California, Central Valley in California, yes. Absolutely. And the notion is that foreign investment is bad, so Trump's trying to restrict that in certain areas. Certainly over the next few weeks we're going to hear more about that. And also the notion that somehow foreign workers are bad. Foreign workers, they pay taxes, they have to contribute to Social Security, and they make the economy go in certain sectors. This isn't to say that we shouldn't do our best to train and hire American workers. In fact, we need to do a lot better with respect to training of workers in upgraded skills for the new economy. But the two are not necessarily in conflict. You can have growth in demand for American workers and growth in demand for foreign workers. There's very little evidence that head-to-head foreign workers are taking the jobs of American workers. In fact, when you look at Southern California, for instance, San Diego, a lot of the cell phone companies and a lot of the industry around there was founded by people from Asia, Indians, Koreans, Chinese, Japanese, and others. And they employ a lot of people. So if you look at the net employment benefits, skilled foreign workers, foreign entrepreneurs, other kinds of workers have really been a net plus for this economy. And it's been part of our history since the 1600s to have foreigners come in, work, found companies, create jobs, and participate in a dynamic American economy.
Now, Trump says that he prefers bilateral arrangements to multilateral arrangements. And that's why we withdrew from TPP early on. Perhaps that's why we withdrew from the Iran treaty. He wants to trash NAFTA. He's even indicated he doesn't like NATO. He says he prefers bilateral arrangements. Now, is there anything to this? What is the logic of that?
Well, let me just talk about the trade part for a minute, since there's a lot to say about that at the outset, at least. And that is, I would be very surprised if he could cite one provision of the TPP that he objected to. He has sort of this visceral negative view of multilateral, or what some call plurilateral trade agreements. Sure, he wants bilateral agreements because he thinks the U.S. has more leverage on bilateral deals than on regional deals, where you have, in fact, on TPP initially 12 countries, now it's 11. But the point that he is missing is that those agreements are multilateral for a reason, and that is it's much better for American companies to have similar trading rules for 11 other countries as opposed to individual trading rules for country A, another set for country B, another set for country C, another set for country D. It's very hard for American companies to comply with different safety standards, different health standards, different labeling standards, different tariff levels, country by country. It's much easier if you have a group of countries with very similar or the same sets of rules, tariff levels, non-tariff barriers.
So much harder to administer, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So I have a question for you, Bob Hormats, and the question is America first good for the United States?
Well, America first is really a label. I think the key point is America, in conjunction with other countries, has done great things for our economy and great things for the world economy and benefited our security and benefited our political influence. So if we look at America's role in the world in the future, we've got to understand that we're a much stronger country if we have strong allies, strong alliances, strong friendships, and strong global institutions in which we have a lot of influence.
So no America only.
Definitely not America only.
Bob Hormats, thank you so much for coming by. This has been just wonderful. What an insight. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.